to fight for freedom every day, in the year, every year, until they win it.
We are the National Union of the Homeless, and we're taking HUD houses again today.
It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes a willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done.
You gotta forget about it being against the law. I don't care. Yeah. I'm dying in the streets. I think that's against the law.
Get down.
Good evening and welcome to It's Kairos Time, Housing as a Human Right. My name is Pauline Pisano. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I am the Communications and Culture Digital Organizer for the Kairos Center. I'm normally running tech for the It's Kairos Time episodes. We are a national organization committed to building a movement to end poverty led by the poor, drawing on the power of religions and human rights. We are a center for movement strategy, coordination, and education among the poor across all lines of division. A Kairos moment is a time when crisis and opportunity collide and the possibility for something new can emerge. It's Kairos Time is a bi-weekly series of 30-minute talks with partners, collaborators, and movement builders where we discuss what's happening and what we're doing to respond to this Kairos moment. This episode, the last of our spring, features Tyrone Hanley, Director of Racial and Economic Justice Initiative from the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Jama Shelton, Associate Director of the Silberman Center for Sexuality and Gender, and Moses Armand. Welcome to our It's Kairos Time participants. A little about them. Moses Armand is an organizer, cultural worker, and third generation almost pastor. He organizes with the Poor People's Campaign and the Freedom Church of the Poor and is a member of the Church of the Common Ground. Moses develops programming for some incredible trans and non-binary youth at the Sam and Devorah Foundation for Transgender Youth, including an annual Trans Youth Retreat, storytelling workshop, and supporting trans mentor projects, a national mentoring program. Tyrone Hanley was born and raised with his two brothers by his Black lesbian mother in a low-income community in the suburbs of Chicago. His mother taught him how to be authentic, loving, curious, and non-judgmental. He brings his upbringing into his work by focusing on those most marginalized in the LGBTQIA community. As Director of Racial and Economic Justice Initiatives at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Tyrone focuses on the criminalization of queer, trans sexuality, and those living with HIV and LGBTQIA poverty. Tyrone was a creator of the End Bad HIV Laws campaign with the Center for HIV Law and Policy and Human Rights campaign. He was also a co-author of the first national LGBTQIA poverty agenda, Intersecting Injustice, a national call to action, addressing LGBTQ poverty and economic justice for all. He's the co-founder of the National LGBTQ Anti-Poverty Action Network and founder of NCLR's We Serve with Love campaign. And then finally, Dr. Jama Shelton is a social worker committed to addressing LGBTQ youth homelessness. They are an associate professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, where they were my professor, and the chief research officer of the True Colors United. Their research examines the experiences of LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. In particular, they are interested in identifying and addressing systemic barriers rooted in hetero-cisgenderism that frequently constrain the successful transition into stable housing for LGBTQ youth and young adults. Welcome to It's Kairos Time. So we're going to get started thinking a little bit about homelessness and poverty as a systemic issue and not an issue of personal failure. We often hear these issues talked about as personal failures, and not a larger systemic issue, I think, because the issue can be so massive that it's so much easier to think of things as an individual failure and not a systems failure. But what we are witnessing right now in this moment, as we're seeing some of the expanded COVID-19 pandemic protections around the child tax credit, around Medicaid, around unemployment benefits, as those are being stripped away right now, it is very clear to us that this is a systemic issue, that we are living in a world of abundance, but we're amidst mass abandonment of whole groups of people. Our analysis would say 140 million poor and dispossessed are living in this nation, and that's about a third of the electorate. And homelessness is the most visible and jarring expression of housing insecurity and policy failure in the United States. Yet millions of people across the nation are living in these unstable housing conditions. And there's a lot in a definition. We can think about unstable housing to think about people that have to double or triple up with other people in housing designed for single families or single people living in their cars, outside of encampments, temporary shelters, couch surfing, and many are just one paycheck or one emergency away from losing their apartment or home. And so Dr. Jama Shelton has this wonderful study named Perceptions, in which one young adult participant and impacted person said, homelessness is when you have to think every day of where you are going to sleep that night. When someone asks you where you live and you don't know how to answer, not having a place to go at any time where you know that you will be safe. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit and ask our guests a little bit about when thinking about homelessness and housing injustice and poverty as systemic issues. There's a lot in a definition. There's a lot in how we perceive of something. There's a lot of invisibility around people who are living in their cars or who don't have a place to call their home, which is a human right. And so, in thinking about that study, Jama, I was wondering, do you feel like we need to have a collective perspective shift about the definition of homelessness and the definition of poverty to more clearly identify it so we can see how it presents itself in this nation and in our society?
Yeah, excellent question, Pauline, and thanks for having me here. Absolutely, we need a radically new understanding of homelessness as a concept, and we need a radically new understanding of what we need to really work culturally to change the assumptions that people make around, I'm going to air quote this, around like a homeless person and who that is. So I think there's actually like two things in your question. One is around sort of definitional issues, which has shown up in my work across the board, because depending on the system someone is navigating, they might be considered homeless in one system and not in another. If you're a young person, you might be considered a youth or a young adult in one system, but not another. And so it's really difficult to have, what that does is creates a huge challenge in developing and then implementing a holistic approach to addressing, in my instance, homelessness among queer and trans young people, because there's no agreement, just like in operationalizing what that means, right? And the other thing I want to say about that, so there's the definitional issue, and then there's the like assumptions around what it means to be homeless. And one of our issues, I think primary issues culturally around this, is that unless you've examined it, unless one has examined it, there's a series of probably images and words and labels that just automatically populate one's mind when you hear the term homeless person. And I don't like that term, but I'm using it specifically because that's a term that's the way we're framing it, as like reducing an individual to this one aspect of their experience. It's not a characteristic of who they are as an individual. It's an experience that they're having, right? So the piece about poverty and how poverty intersects here, and what I think we're in a particular moment to also do is when we look at queer and homelessness among queer and trans young people, the go-to sort of response around pathways and causes is identity-based family rejection. Like that's what people go to, right? And for some people, that is true. And for other people, it is not true at all. And for some people, it's a both and, right? But what that does is it's even if we're like, oh, no young person deserves to experience homelessness. So we don't have the like individual fault, personal responsibility of the young person in this particular narrative when it's the family's fault, but we have the family system now as the fault. Like they are like the focus becomes then on we have to like make sure these terrible like rejecting parents don't do this or whatever, right? And it completely ignores the structural causes, completely ignores poverty, completely ignores the lack of affordable housing, the like centuries of racist housing policy we have in our country, and creates sort of like a really negative and harmful sub-narrative around the intersections of race and family acceptance. Because if you look at the data, the best data we have around proportions of young people experiencing homelessness that are queer or trans, their youth of color, primarily Black youth, are overrepresented in those statistics, right? So by sort of like perpetuating this narrative that it's all because of family rejection, we're also creating this, I'm going to say, for some unintentional and for some perhaps intentional, sub-narrative that Black families are homophobic and transphobic, when in fact that's not a fair conclusion to reach. When a lot of the young people that I've worked with over the years have been young people of color, have been Black youth who are still very much supported by and in contact with their families, but they're living in such extreme poverty in doubled up situations like you mentioned, that they turned 18 and they had to leave. Like that is their reality because of poverty, not because of identity. So I think we have a moment here also to begin to lift the lens from the family responsibility as it relates to queer and trans young people to the structural issues.
That's great. Thank you. And I'd like to invite our other participants to kind of respond a little bit in this moment.
Yeah, I actually thank you for saying that, because it's something that I try to emphasize in the work that I do related to like queer and trans people and economic justice. You know, the Williams Institute actually found the main driver of poverty for queer and trans people in adulthood is that they experienced poverty in their childhood. It wasn't that they were queer and trans. And then it also reminds me, one of the legal aids in New York City, they did a study like what are the legal priorities of low-income LGBTQ people. And what they found was it was the same as other poor people. And so I think this narrative that, you know, the LGBTQ movement has really made around poverty and homelessness is really centered around identity and ignoring these economic structures that actually are driving people into poverty. And I think it also in many ways justifies the system, saying like, it's not the system's the problem, is maybe like homophobia and transphobia, unaccepting families, you know, maybe discriminatory employers, like that's it. But if we can just fix these from a legal standpoint, then the system otherwise is fine. And no, it's not. We know that plenty of people are struggling. And yes, that includes queer and trans people. And obviously being queer and trans can exacerbate the issues that one may experience, like while like, you know, not having a home or with poverty. But at the end of the day, like we can make this world completely like LGBTQ friendly. And if we're not addressing poverty itself, like we're still going to have queer and trans people who are poor. So I think that is a really important point. And I think that's also why I think it's important for the LGBTQ movement to move away from like this very like identity first model, especially when we're talking about issues of like economics, because I think it's not the full picture. And in fact, it's only a small part of the picture. So again, I really appreciate you saying that.
Well, yeah, and I think also this question too, and these responses also make me think that like, in addition to kind of the need for a narrative shift and an acknowledgement that like homelessness and poverty is a policy choice, I also think there's a need for like a moral shift in people and just like a shift in the moral narrative, because I think in this country, like, it's just such a pervasive narrative, not just for lawmakers, but for people who have believed in this lie that, like, you know, to have dignity or to have respect or have the basic human necessities of food, water, shelter, healthcare, that you have to earn it. And that's not just something that is your right, but it's instead something that, like, you have to earn. And so how can we, like, shift this narrative and have folks understand that actually all these things are actually what your God-given rights are? Like, that is just, like, your right as a human being and being alive. So I think a lot too about the moral shift that we kind of have to think about as well.
That's so great. The radical revolution of values, you know, those that structural shift. And so if we think about like what a radical, you know, revolution of values kind of looks like and how it expresses itself in policy, we think, you know, we think about various economic interventions that we know work. Housing vouchers, rental assistance, affordable housing, cash assistance, you know, medical care, you know, all these things that are actually our right. We actually have a universal human rights document that we all have. And we know that it's also possible for all of these things. And so, you know, I think part of the problem is that what's happening is that the decision makers are not centering those who are impacted. And so decisions are being made about people, not like by the people who know exactly what needs to happen. And so I think in thinking about organizing and uniting the 140 million poor and dispossessed here, like what are some things that we're kind of doing that to kind of center the voices of those directly impacted? Like what's some of the work that you kind of see? Where's the hope? Where's the building of you know, hope and justice in the world? And so I know, Tyrone, you're doing a lot of work and thinking this through, and I kind of want to kick this to you for a second. You know, what's some of the work that you're seeing? What's some of the hope that you're seeing on the ground right now that we're not hearing maybe in mass media?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important piece of the conversation. You know, when we talk about centering the voices of the people who are most impacted by the violence of the society that we live in, what I think that means is understand that they see the flaws and the problems with it because they literally have to navigate it on a day-to-day basis. I also think that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be expected to do the burden of the work, because I've seen that in movement space. There's like, oh, Black trans woman, tell me what you need. And then basically like all the decision, all the work kind of gets put on them. And I think that to me, it's more of like following the priorities and the things at the forefront of people's minds. And then those of us who are privileged, I think that supporting and being in partnership with folks who are directly impacted and not expecting them to do the work. And what I've been noticing, and in terms of a lot of movement spaces that I'm in, that like the issue that comes up is housing, whether it be HIV, reentry, LGBTQ, all these spaces that everyone's like housing is the issue. And I think that to me, it's like really helped me to understand, like from an economic justice perspective, at least from a domestic side of things, that until we address affordable housing, we're not going to realize a world in which we are experiencing economic justice. And so that's for that reason, I am like trying to very much focus on affordable housing. And the thing that also is really important to me is that I've come to the understanding that I think it's really impossible to address affordable housing as long as housing is a commodity, that people are making money off of housing, because literally people see their homes or their rental, like they have a rental property as an investment. And so, or people, and that includes people who are owning their homes, right? It's like, I buy this home and I want 30 years from now to be able to sell it at not even maybe 30 years, maybe 10 years from now at a higher rate. So when you're thinking about your community, you're thinking like, how can this help my property value go up? So like, if you have people who are unhoused and, you know, you want to build, you know, the city may want to build a shelter or a space or a transitional housing unit, people want to resist it. It was like, well, I don't want this because this is going to, you know, cause a decrease in my property value. And so community and people no longer, it's not about like who you're in partnership with community with, but like, how do they actually help contribute to your investment. And I think that's a horrible way to structure society. And I also think that it puts way too much power into the hands of landlords. Like and we're seeing that more and more housing is being owned by these corporations that really are just thinking of profit, right? Like they don't care about like who's in the units. They just want to make sure like every year they can increase the value of their investments. And so we're seeing like in places like DC, New York City, because, you know, both of these locations, I'm sure probably other parts of the country, they're attaching what's allowed for even in rent control units, how much rent can go up because of inflation. We're seeing like in DC, some of the highest level of like what's being permitted in terms of the caps or rent increases that DC has ever seen in the 40 years of existence of rent control. Like this can literally mean like a huge number of people displaced. And I think that to me, is like I think this is like a calling for us that like more of us need to be really invested in this issue and really think about like how we're structuring our housing system. And I think that to me, it really means that we need to move, like, as I was saying earlier, move it away from a commodity and seeing it as a social good, right? And that we need to move to a more like social housing kind of format. So where like, this is not about investing like in terms of making money off it, but like, how can you create a home in a place that you can find security and kind of like have a place where you can feel loved and kind of like just kind of like unwind from the world. Like I know that for the pandemic, having a stable housing really allowed me to really address a lot of the emotional and the mental needs that I really needed to address, and the slowdown allowed me an opportunity to do that. But it's because I have a housing that was stable. And I also know that me growing up, you know, in Section 8 housing, because our rent was not connected to the private market, but like our rent was based on how much my mom brought in, that our housing was a lot more stable than a lot of other poor folks. When I read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, like it made me cry because I realized like, wow, we were like one of the very few lucky ones. Even that was traumatic for me growing up in like, you know, poverty, but like also recognizing that, you know, so many people who are in my situation don't even have that. And so I think that to me, it's like, I think that we need to be honest. And I think that housing is really the center of a lot of these issues. And I'm really excited because I think more and more people are understanding that and rethinking, you know, how do we approach this issue? And it's not a one-off, but I think it's actually critical if we're going to, you know, realize economic justice in our society.
That's beautiful. I thank you for bringing in like your personal story into this conversation, and then just also thinking about, you know, you're really evoking this idea of like a person-oriented society versus a thing-oriented society. When computers, machines, and property rights are more important than people, we are a nation headed towards spiritual death. And so all of us, regardless of whatever our situation is in this moment, must be concerned with a society that is thing-based and not person-based, because what are we building? What are we building? And so I'd like to actually invite some of the other participants in, Moses and Jama, to be thinking a little bit more about this issue about person-oriented society. And one thing that's really fun and exciting about this last episode of It's Kairos Time is that we're all actually culture workers. We've all kind of come into this work in thinking about culture. And so in thinking about, you know, what it looks like, what's happening on the ground to build this person-oriented society, we've got, you know, calls for policy around, you know, if there's 6 vacant lots for every person that doesn't have a safe place to stay, why are there 6 vacant lots? And so in thinking about the making visible what is what's being made invisible, how to shine a spotlight on that and different cultural interruptions that we can have with that. So I actually want to kick it to Moses a little bit to talk about you know, what are some cultural interruptions that you've been a part of, that you've helped create, you know, and the power that you've kind of seen, and then maybe we'll close with Jama sharing about some of the cultural interruptions that you have also made.
Yeah, yeah, it was interesting. I feel like this question made me think about yesterday on Democracy Now! They did like they played an hour-long interview they had done with Harry Belafonte, and I've just been thinking about one of the things that he said, where he said, I don't want to misquote it, but it was music as a tool of social transformation, and I just thought that was like such that was such a beautiful way to put it. And I've just been like thinking and praying on that, because I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is in my work with trans and non-binary youth, like one of the things that we want to do is we want to have like a movie night with them. And I'm just like, we can't believe how hard it is to find a movie that's age appropriate, that will leave like the youth that we work with happy and inspired and feeling like they are loved and they are capable, and like really uplift them. And we're just seeing like a real need for these kinds of stories. And so I think back to like this call, and I think about like in what you do, like what is the kind of social invitation you want to put out in your work. And I think a lot of what we do at Sam and Deborah, like we do a lot of storytelling. We know that like everybody has a story to tell, and we know that people respond to that in so many different ways. It's not just prose, it's not just poetry. It might be art, it might be dancing, it might be like doing comedy or making a video, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. And we also really try to make space and lift up opportunities where folks can share their joys and they can share like their dreams and their futures and their hopes. We just started like a T4C coffee house hour where basically it's all these prompts that are like, you're writing a trans rom-com, like who is the main character, what is the plot line, or, you know, what is your dream as big as you want to. And it's not that we're not acknowledging that, like, and having space for really like how painful things can be and how hard things are right now, but we also just like never want folks to lose that like they deserve to be happy, and that no one is allowed to take away like their happiness and their future for them, and no one is allowed to take away like their right to dream about like who they want to be and you know what they hope to see for themselves. And so it's interesting because that quote is, you know, as I think about this question and as I hold up a mirror to like myself and my past work, I just keep like asking myself like, you know, what is the social change that you want to illuminate and through this tool, right? Like, will you tell stories where like we get to be happy and where we get to be funny and silly and like, you know, all these things in addition to being, you know, trans or non-binary? Will we get to have stories where we win? Will we get to have stories where we show people like what it means to be a part of a movement and what that does to you to like have a movement family? And will we have stories where like we can survive and where we can thrive, and not just stories where, you know, it's all the pain and stuff? Like, what is the social information that we want to put out in these tools? And so I just think I've been reflecting on that a lot. And I also think that's also something that I've raised to a few of my cultural workers, like comrades, is like kind of this question and this challenge almost. So yeah.
That's so powerful. I want to think about the power of the poor, and how it's kind of showcased in this different way, and just the power of, you know, the narrative shift that needs to happen, the heart and spirit of what needs to happen. So on, I believe it was March 31st, there were a bunch of the Silberman Center for Sexuality and Gender did a project around Trans Day of Visibility. And what was so moving around that was that there was, I remember actually this photo of you, Jama, actually saying that I see you like you matter. And we don't see those pictures out there, but to the need to showcase our humanity, because when we're talking about everybody has a right to a safe place to be, we're talking about everybody has a life to be, like has a right to be who they are and to live and to dream and to kind of, that's the society that we need to build, that person oriented society. And so, you know, when I saw that picture of you, Dr. Shelton, it was very moving. It was very moving to me. And I know it wasn't just moving to me. I know that you actually, as with all your work, you have the data. Paging Dr. James has got the data around, you know, how successful that was and how we actually really need to engage in these ways, because the digital space is a new space. It's a new landscape. It's new land that we cannot cede, that we must cultivate in this belief that everybody has a right to live and be who they are inherently, and that we all have inherent dignity. And so would you like to share a little bit about that project?
Yeah, thank you. I would love to. I want to say first, Moses, I was like listening to your response to the earlier question. I was like, getting teary. It was so moving. And for me, it connects to what Tyrone was saying, and Pauline, what you were saying earlier about having a people-centered society instead of a thing-based society. Because when we have a thing-based society and people continue to be invisibilized and often reacting to the next thing because so much is being thrown at us, we have to really intentionally find and carve out, and not everybody is able to, the space to dream our way forward. Because if we can't, like, it's from, Pauline, maybe you remember seeing this in CO class, but that video from the Southern Movement Assembly where there's a man who's like, it's not enough to know we don't want to be treated like dogs. Like, we know that, but we have to also know what it is that we're wanting so that we have a direction to go forward. So that was just running through my mind while you were talking, Moses, along with the idea that what we pay attention to grows, which is Adrienne Marie Brown, who has so many amazing things to say. And so that was sort of, that thinking was our framing for the Trans Day of Visibility campaign that we did. We're one of many organizations and people and groups to do something on the International Trans Day of Visibility. We found it, we really wanted to do something because we're situated in a school of social work, and social workers have a certain amount of like positionality and power to do something. And the profession writ large has been incredibly negligently silent on this issue, which is, in my mind, in direct conflict with our code of ethics. So we definitely wanted to do something. And there's so much negativity right now because there's so many bad things happening legislatively and interpersonally and institutionally around trans rights, that we decided we only wanted positive messages. And so we gave people, here's 2 positive messages. You matter to me, and trans rights are human rights. And let's just do our best to get that out there. Because even if it was positive, like, please take action, call your senator, that's still replicating, like, reminding people of how bad things are. So we just really wanted that. I see you, you matter to me. And we reached our reach was close to 1 million people, which I know is, in the world of digital organizing, is not huge. For a very small 2-person volunteer run center that works with organizing students, that was huge for us. And we got so much traction that this is the one of the challenges or things we're still figuring out around how to cultivate the digital land, as you said, Pauline, is now what? Because we don't want that to just fizzle away. So from that, we launched Trans Justice Tuesdays, which is just sort of a carryover from Trans Day of Visibility, where we can continue to share positive messages of joy. And I know I'm sort of rambling right now, but I want to connect it back also to the paradigm shift around how we think about people experiencing homelessness, which I think also is directly relevant to how we think about people, poor people. And that is, we have to humanize people. And I don't mean just like put a face, because people can conjure up a face or an image, but I mean the joy piece. I don't mean the resilience piece. I heard a quote the other day where someone was like, why are we celebrating resilience? That's like, so you've got a really thick helmet and you're hitting your head against the wall. We don't need people to like get a stronger helmet. We need to like take down the wall, right? Instead of celebrating the fact that they're able to like bump their head up against it and be okay. That wasn't my saying. That was Greta Bauer, who's a researcher. I don't want to take credit for that. But anyway, in the homelessness space, and I think now in the like trans rights space, what we are really working to do is counter the risk-based, damage-centered research narrative. And that's something from my positionality as an academic and as a researcher I can do. I have that ability to do that in my work. And so I think that's something for everyone to think about in their work too. Like you said, Moses, holding a mirror up and being like, what do I want to highlight here? And in the world of academic research, which is very interconnected with funding and governmental funding and mandates and risk reduction and all of that, there has to be room for a focus on joy and thriving, and that that's the kind of research we need to be doing, rather than perpetuating the damage-centered narrative that then ends up creating something Tyrone mentioned earlier around like, that ends up creating like identity-based disparities that just are presumed to be true, right? So when you look at some of the trans youth homelessness qualitative work I've done, there are young people saying like, yeah, homelessness sucks. It sucked. Like no one should have to do it. I didn't want to be there. It was terrible, lots of trauma, and it saved my life. And we saved each other's lives. And I found my own family and home. And so for me, I'm holding those like simultaneous truths of like, our systems are failing. We live in a land of abundance. We need to make sure that like that changes radically. And people who need to, out of necessity, are saving their own lives through like mutual aid efforts and, you know, creatively operating outside of systems and the state, because the state and those systems have always failed them. So I think as organizers and cultural workers, to me, like that's a like pretty constant tension that I hold in terms of where do I shine the light at what moment and what's going to be the most helpful, which also brings back into the conversation, I think, the like critical importance of always working in partnership with people who are impacted, whether it's by poverty or homelessness or anti-trans legislation or whatever that might be.
Well, thank you so much. And any other responses from our guests in this moment? Any last words as we come across our closing?
I just want to say and thank you for those points. Like, I think it really needs to be a social movement. Like, I think it's like literally how we live our lives in the day to day. And, you know, I think a lot of my work is very much focused on policy, but like, how are we actually hanging out, or what are the spaces where we're together, like to be the embodiment of this world? Like I think that's how we create it. We don't wait to dismantle the system. Like we can create it now, right? Like those structures and a new way of interacting and being with one another. And that's a social movement. I think, unfortunately, so much of our efforts are been like put in this like very like professional class and, you know, nonprofit industrial complex. Like, I don't think that's going to be the ultimate solution. Like, it has to be something that is so diffuse that is beyond like 501c3s. And so that's where I'm really trying to focus my work. And I think that's where I find the most joy and the most creativity and love and excitement and pleasure. And so I really hope that whatever we're building, that it's fun, it is sexy, and it's camp. And because I think that's the vibe, and that's the vibe that I hope to embrace.
100%. And while you were talking, Tyrone, I just chatted to Pauline as you were saying that. And that is, again, shout out to one of my heroes, Adrienne Marie Brown, who talks about exactly that. Like you create the world that you want in what's right in front of you, and it's fractal thinking. And if enough of us are doing that, that's the world that we are building over time. And the change we create in our small circle then ripples out through the whole system. It changes the whole system. It might not make it be exactly what we want just yet, but it creates a ripple effect and a change. And the joy and camp part, I'm totally down for.
Yes, very much so. You know, it made me think a Kairos moment is a moment of like crisis and opportunity, where those two things collide. And that's exactly what we're talking about. There's an opportunity here. And I think, you know, I've been really thinking about this quote by Du Bois in this chapter of the history of propaganda, where Du Bois quotes and says, you know, he's talking about Reconstruction and is saying, you know, at a time of this amazing moment of Reconstruction where people stole themselves out of the system and freed themselves, and they were about to lead us towards more democracy, that we fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with the past to make peace in the present, to set policy in the future. And what we're talking about is we're talking about telling the truth right now so we can set policy in the future. And the truth right now is that we have a right to thrive. And the truth is right now that poor people are organizing and building power through love and through the humanization of each other against all odds. And so with that, I would love to thank you all so much for joining It's Kairos Time. This has been a series that has just meant so much to me. I hope that you check out all of our other episodes. We will be launching this as a podcast. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm usually not on this side. I'm usually on the back end. You don't see me, but I'm thinking about Joy. I did dye my hair pink last night for this session, so I was thinking about you all. And I wish everyone a lovely evening. To please follow the work of these amazing leaders that we have with us today. And I hope that you all have a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Today and every day, we at the Kairos Center wake up and we declare Jubilee. We demand it. What does it mean to seek Jubilee in a time of moral crisis, in a time where every day it's so easy to wake up and think about everything wrong with the world? It's so easy to think that we should not be demanding Jubilee. But we demand Jubilee because we here have read the Constitution. We declare Jubilee because we here are rooted in our deepest moral beliefs, and these texts and these beliefs are screaming, are begging for us to stand up and demand our rights. We, the people, everywhere. From Alaska to Arkansas, the Carolinas to California, Mississippi to Maine, Kansas to Kentucky, the Bronx to the border, Appalachian haulers to Apache sacred lands must not stay silent anymore because somebody's been hurting our people and it's gone on far too long. We, the people, must ask these questions. What would it look like? What would this world look like if we, the people, came up and recognized that, as they say in the National Union of the Homeless, Jesus never asked for a copay, so neither should we. What if we listened to our great prophet, Reverend Dr. King, when he asked, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? Or what if we acknowledge, as Reverend Dr. Barber said, that some in this nation have become too comfortable with death at the hands of the state, and we, the people, stood up and demanded that enough is enough. Enough is enough, because we, the people, do not deserve to be looked over, and we, the people, do not deserve to have our lives taken for granted, because we, the people, recognize our humanity and recognize that those at the top, the corporations that benefit from our death, those who hoard wealth in the hands of few while many suffer, and those greedy with power wish they could have what we have, which is love, which is dignity, and which is, when we unite in a moral fusion movement, is a power so great that we cannot be ignored. We declare Jubilee because, as Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris said, we believe that we can win. What it means to declare Jubilee now is to recognize our humanity and recognize that for the well-being of we, the people, we must invest in life. We mobilize, we organize, we register, and we educate because we believe that everybody's got a right to live. We write moral policy because we know that policy can be violent, policy can be cruel, but we, the people, will no longer sit idly and watch people destroy our homes, our lands, our lives, and our loved ones. So we, the people, will let justice roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream.